Welcome to Learning React with me. In this video, I'm going to show you another useful hook in React called useContext. Let us first create a demo application where we will be having a login screen. On login, we should display header and a home page. In the home page, we display the list of users. When we click on any user, we display the details of the user. If the logged in user has admin access, he will see an option to delete the user. So first, let's add two state variables. Const is user logged in and a method to set user logged in status using a useState hook. And initially this will be false, so the user is not logged in. And another variable which says whether the logged in user has admin access or not. So set admin equals useState, and even this will be false initially. I have created the components already for the login, header and home page. In the login, we have two inputs, one for username and the other for password. We have a button. When we click on the login button, it calls a method to set the value of this property is user logged in to true. In this example, we are not validating this username and password. Just for the sake of demo, I'm simply passing the value as true. Ideally, you would be validating if these two values are existing in your database or not. Only if it is, then you will set the value of this property as true. For now, for the demo purpose, just pass it as true. So this method will be coming from the props. We have header component. This is a simple header component with dummy links. And then we have a home page component. This is from the example which I used in the previous video where we discussed useEffect. So if you are new to useEffect, please feel free to watch that video so that this concept will be clear. So in the home page, we are basically calling a API to get the list of users, and we are assigning the data returned by the API to this user state. And this user state will be passed as a prop to the user list component. Inside the user list component, we are looping through the each and every user from this user's array. And when we click on this particular user, you will set the ID variable or ID state to the ID of the selected user. And this ID will be used to call another API to fetch the details of that particular user which you selected. So this API will give us the extra details of the user that you clicked on, and we are setting that details to this property user. We are using useEffect, but instead of calling it every time, we have a dependency array here. Only when the ID of the selected user changes, this API will be called and this user state will be set, which is initially null. And in this component only, we are displaying the details of the user by using the another component user. So in this user component, if the user is present, that means initially this value is null. So when we initially do not click on any user, it should display this message. So if the user object is null, then we see a message no user selected. And once we click on a particular user, this API will be called and user details will be available. So in that case, we are going to display the username and the email of the user, a name of the user, username of the user, and email of the user. So this is our example. And let's add some code here to display all these components on the screen. So my requirement is if the user is not logged in, I should be seeing the login page. And if the user is logged in, I should be seeing the header, and below that we should see the home page, which would display the list of users. So let me use a conditional rendering here. So using this property, if this property is true, then we need to display header and home page. So let me make use of React fragments to display these two components. So I'll just say header, and below this I'll display home page component. And if the user is not logged in, then we want to see the login component. And for this login component, we need a prop which will have a login method. So let's define one method here. Let me just call this method as update login status. And this will receive some value from the login component. And once it receives the value, we make use of this login status method to set this value. So this will update this property here. And we also need to determine if the user is admin or not. So for now, let's just assume that the user is admin. So I will simply pass it as true for the sake of demo. Now let's pass this method as a property to the login, and let me give that property name as onLogin. So that's it. So we are passing the reference of this method to this login component, and this login component, when we click on login button, it will call this method by passing a value. Let's look at the UI now. So this is the login page. Since the user logged in is false, we see the login screen, and we have username and password and login button. Let's just enter something, and let me click on login. So I'm not validating anything, but we are simply passing true. So this true will be coming here, and this properties will be set to true. So now, since the logged in user property is true, we are seeing header and home page. And we made a API call to display the user's name. And since we didn't select any of the user, we see no user selected message. Now let me click on some user. We see this details, extra details. Now I click on this one, we see the details of this particular user. Now what I want is, if the user has admin access, I want to see a button here so that I'll be able to delete this record. Let's see how we can do that. So we have this admin property in the app component. I want to use this inside user component. But what is the communication flow to pass is admin property from app component to user component? Let's assume that user component receives a prop called isAdmin, and let us try to display a delete button, a cross symbol just after this email. Okay, let me add some code here. So if the user is admin, then we are going to display this button. This is the HTML code to display a cross button. Now let's save it. And this prop has to come from user list, because this is where we are using the user component. So let us also assume that a user list is getting a prop called isAdmin. So let me just add a prop here, is admin, and this again comes from props.isAdmin. Now this users list is being called in the home page. So if this props has a property called isAdmin, this should be definitely coming from a place where users list is being called. So let me just copy the same property here and use it in the homepage component where we are calling the user list. Now for the home page to receive prop, it should be passed from app.js, because this is where we are calling the homepage component. So let us add the same thing here as well. But this is not props.admin, it's just isAdmin. Let me just refresh so that we come from the beginning. I enter something and click on login, and we see this users list, and I click on one of the users. We see the user details, and by default we are assuming that the logged in user is admin, so I am able to see the cross button here which says delete. Now let me just make it false to see if our code is working fine. Now if I refresh, just log in and click on some username, I don't see the delete button because this user does not have admin access. Let us try to picturize what we did so far. We have an app component where we have three other components: login, header, and home. Based on the logged in user status, we are displaying the login or header and home pages. Once the user logs in, we will see the home page, and inside the home page we are calling user list component, and inside user list we have user component. App component has isAdmin property, and user component needs that property to display delete button. So what did we do? From app component, we passed it to home component, and from there to user list component, and finally to the user component. So if you observe, isAdmin has nothing to do with home and user list. It just has a purpose to display delete button in the user component, but we are passing unnecessary data to the home and user list. In our case, it's just a Boolean property. In real world applications, you might be dealing with huge data, which would be unnecessarily passed to multiple components just to make sure that it is reached to one final destination. So, React has provided a better way to handle such situations where you do not have to pass data to each and every component, but you can directly access the data in the component where it is required. That is where use context hook would help us. Let's see how to use it. To use context hook, first we need to create the context. So what is context? Context is nothing but providing data to the components. It doesn't matter where the component is located in the component tree, but we find a mechanism to share data between components by not passing down the component tree. So in order to do that, we have something called create context provided by React library. And let's create a context property to store the object returned by context. So in the create context, we pass a default value. Initially, since we are using this context to store this admin property, I am passing this as false in the beginning. Now we have created the context. The second step is to provide this context to the component tree. How do we do that? So this context will have a provider. Context dot provider. And this will take a property called value, to which we are going to provide the object or property or state, whatever it is that you want to share down the component tree. So here I am going to pass isAdmin. This component dot provider should be wrapped around the components to which you want to share the data. In my case, I want to share this isAdmin data to any component that is inside the app.js or in the component tree. For example, app.js in this case has three components. So I want this isAdmin property to be accessed anywhere inside these three components or the components nested within these components. So let me just wrap it around these three components. So all my code that belongs to app.js will be present between this div. So I'm just providing my provider here so that all the code within this will have access to this isAdmin property. So the second step is done. First, we created the context. Second, we created the provider. Now the third step is to consume this provider. Now, where do we have the requirement? It is in the user.js component. Previously, we passed it down the component tree. Now we don't need that. So let me remove that. From the home component, we passed it to user list. So let's remove it here as well. And from here to the user. Let me just remove it here as well. Coming to the third step, consuming the context. This is where we use the useContext hook. So let me just import useContext from React library, and let me create a context property. I'll just call it value or isAdmin. Let's make it isAdmin only. And we need to access this from context. So I will say use context of. So we need to access the context which we created here. Let me just make this global context. You can also put this inside another file and just export it. So I will just export this context so that we can access it in this. So let's just say context. So this is imported from app.js. This context is going to return us whatever value we supplied here. So I am going to get a boolean value, and we are storing that boolean value here. And now this is coming from this property, not from props.isAdmin. Let's just save it, go back to the UI and see if the application is working as it worked previously. So we have our login page. I'll try to log in. When I click on login, we see the user details, and since we didn't click on any user, it just says no user selected. Now let me click on some user. It will display the user details, and we don't see the delete button because in app.js this is set to false. Let me set to true, and now if I try to log in and select a user, now we see the delete button. So the application is working as expected. The only difference is instead of sending the isAdmin property through all these components, we just directly accessed it in this component using useContext hook. So in the consumption of context, there is another way. Instead of using useContext, we can use context.consumer. Let's see how we can do that. So let me just comment it, and here I will say context dot consumer, and let's close the tag here. So inside this we can access the value. In our case it is admin, and let me just move this code inside this. So if you have more than one HTML element, you may have to enclose it within a div or a fragment. But since we have only one paragraph, this should be fine. So let's just save it. So here we didn't use the use context hook. We used another way through the consumer provided by the context. You don't have to name it isAdmin. This name is up to you. But whatever name you provide here, make sure you use the same name here as well. So let's just save it. Go back to the UI. Let me refresh and log in. Now I'll select something. Since it was true, we are seeing this delete button. Now let's make it false and log in. Now I'm not seeing the delete button. To summarize, we had an application where we had to pass the data from one component to another component down the component tree so that we can use it to display a button or not based on that property. And remember, this is called prop drilling. And to avoid sending too much data to all the unnecessary components, we made use of the concept provided by React called context to manage data globally and access it in any component in the component tree. First, we created a context, then we added a provider in the app component by passing the value is admin to this provider. We needed that value in the user component, so we used a consumer. This consumer can be added in two ways. One, using the useContext hook, and the other way is to use the consumer object provided by context. Now, is admin property is maintained globally in the context where you don't have to pass it to the home and user list components. I hope this concept is clear. Use context is a useful hook if you want to manage small amount of data globally. In case of a huge amount of data that you want to manage globally, you can use other mechanisms like using a Redux library, which would be easier in case of a complex application. But if it's a simple state, you can always make use of the context API provided by React. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe to InterviewPro.